God's plan for your life is perfect, even when you can't see it. This is a profound truth that every believer must hold tightly to, especially when life seems difficult, when the road ahead is unclear, or when everything around you feels like it's falling apart. It's a hard truth to grasp at times, especially when you're in the midst of struggle. We tend to think that if something is going wrong, then God must not be in control, but nothing could be further from the truth. Take, for example, the story of Joseph. His life was anything but easy. Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers, who were so filled with jealousy that they sold him into slavery. Imagine the betrayal, the hurt, the confusion. Here was a young man who had done nothing wrong, yet his brothers, the people he loved and trusted most, turned their backs on him. And it didn't stop there. Joseph's life only became more painful. He was falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and as a result, he found himself thrown into prison. Yet, even in the midst of all this, God was with Joseph. In the deepest, darkest moments of his life, God's hand was guiding him. In prison, God elevated Joseph to a position of influence, eventually leading him to become second in command over all of Egypt. He was placed in a position where he could not only save a nation, but also reconcile with his brothers, the very ones who had wronged him. Now imagine for a moment that Joseph didn't know the end of the story. Imagine that he was in the midst of betrayal and suffering and couldn't see past it. It would have been easy to despair, to lose hope, to question whether God was still present. But Joseph knew something that we all must remember in our own lives. God's plan is perfect, even when we can't see it. He knew that even in the darkest of circumstances, God was still in control. There are moments in life when we cannot understand why things are happening the way they are. We don't know why we're facing a particular struggle, why a relationship is falling apart, or why we're dealing with illness or financial hardship. The world tells us that we must have control over everything, that we must know exactly what's happening and why. But that's not the way of God. God doesn't ask us to have everything figured out. He asks us to trust Him, to believe that His plan is unfolding even when we cannot see the entire picture. We often have a limited view of the world. Our understanding is constrained by time, by our own experiences, and by our inability to see the future. But God's perspective is eternal. He sees the beginning from the end. He sees the full scope of our lives, every joy, every sorrow, every trial, and every victory. And in His infinite wisdom, He orchestrates the perfect plan for each of us, a plan that works together for our good, even when it doesn't make sense to us in the moment. In those moments of confusion, we must remember that our perspective is not the same as God's. Our small view of the world can often cause us to misinterpret situations. When we are faced with trials, we may feel as though God has abandoned us or that He is punishing us. But in truth, God is refining us, teaching us, and preparing us for something greater. The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 8:28 that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This is a promise we can hold on to in the midst of our struggles. Even in the pain, even in the hardship, God is working for our good. We may not see it right away, and it may not always feel good in the moment, but the God who is eternal, who sees all things, is working everything together for His purpose and for our ultimate benefit. It's important to remember that God's plan is not always about what is happening to you right now. Sometimes it's about what He's preparing you for in the future. Think about the way He prepared Joseph. He didn't become second in command overnight. God used his time in prison, his time in servitude, and even his time of betrayal to prepare him for the future. God was refining Joseph's character, teaching him how to lead and shaping him into the man He needed him to be. And at the right time, God raised Joseph up to fulfill the purpose He had set for him. When you are in the midst of difficulty, when you are wondering why things are happening the way they are, remember that God is shaping you, molding you, and preparing you for something greater. Trust that He is working all things together for your good, even when it feels like nothing is going the way you expect. Even when your plans fall apart, know that God's plan is still unfolding, and it is perfect in every way. God's plan for your life is not dependent on your ability to see the whole picture. It's dependent on His ability to work all things together for your good. So when life gets tough, when you can't see the way forward, hold fast to the truth that God's plan is perfect, even when you can't see it. Trust that He is at work behind the scenes, working everything out for your good and His glory. Trusting God's plan for your life requires surrender. This is not just a suggestion, but a vital principle of the Christian walk. Surrendering to God doesn't mean giving up on your dreams or abandoning hope. Rather, it means yielding your will to His greater purpose for your life. It's about acknowledging that God knows what is best for you, even when you don't understand why things are happening the way they are. True surrender requires releasing control over your circumstances, your desires, and your plans, and trusting that God will lead you according to His divine wisdom. In our human nature, we like to be in control. We like to have a sense of direction, a plan that we can follow, and the ability to make decisions that align with our desires. The problem is, when we insist on holding on to control, we limit God's ability to work freely in our lives. Our vision is restricted, and we often make decisions based on what seems good at the moment rather than what is best for our eternal purpose. Surrendering to God means acknowledging that His ways are higher than our ways and His thoughts higher than our thoughts. He sees the end from the beginning, and His plan for us is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own understanding. Consider the story of Abraham, the father of faith. God called Abraham to leave his home, his family, and everything he knew to go to a place that God would show him. Abraham didn't have all the details. God didn't give him a map or a clear timeline. He simply told Abraham to go, and Abraham had to choose whether he would trust God enough to step into the unknown. Abraham's obedience was an act of surrender. He had to let go of his own desires for security and comfort in order to follow God's leading. But the ultimate test of Abraham's surrender came when God asked him to sacrifice his son, Isaac, the son of promise. Isaac was not just any child. He was the child that God had promised Abraham and Sarah when they were both elderly. God had given Abraham a promise, and now God was asking him to give it back. Abraham's heart must have been torn as he prepared to obey God's command, but in that moment, he chose to surrender everything, his son, his dreams, his understanding of God's promises, to God's will. Abraham trusted that God knew what he was doing, even when the command seemed impossible to understand. God stopped Abraham from going through with the sacrifice, providing a ram in Isaac's place. But in that moment of surrender, Abraham experienced a deep revelation of God's faithfulness and provision. Abraham's act of surrender wasn't about blind obedience, but about trust. It was about believing that God's plan for his life was greater than anything he could have imagined. Abraham's surrender was rewarded with a deeper relationship with God and a greater understanding of His faithfulness. Surrendering to God is not always easy. It's easy to trust God when things are going well, when life is calm and we can see the direction we're headed. But when things take an unexpected turn, when the road ahead is unclear, that's when the true test of surrender comes. Will we still trust God? Will we still believe that He has a good plan for us, even when our circumstances don't reflect it? In the story of Job, we see a man who was tested in ways most of us can hardly imagine. Job lost his wealth, his health, and his family, all in the blink of an eye. His world crumbled, and his friends came to tell him that his suffering was a result of his sin. Job's pain was unbearable, and yet, in the midst of his suffering, he refused to curse God or turn away from Him. Job's surrender was not easy, but it was steadfast. Even when he didn't understand why he was suffering, he still trusted God. Job's surrender didn't mean he understood God's plan, but it meant he chose to believe in God's goodness, even in the midst of his pain. The truth is that surrendering to God's plan is not a one-time decision. It's a daily choice. Every day, we must choose to lay down our own desires, our own plans, and our own understanding, and trust that God knows what is best for us. It's in this place of surrender that we experience true peace and freedom. When we release control, we allow God to move in ways that we could never have imagined on our own. A surrender is also a process of transformation. The more we surrender to God, the more we become like Christ. Jesus, the perfect example of surrender, said, "Not my will, but yours be done," Luke 22:42. He knew that God's plan was far greater than his own desires, and he chose to submit to the will of the Father, even unto death. In his surrender, Jesus opened the way for us to experience salvation and reconciliation with God. When we surrender our lives to God, we are not giving up, we are yielding to a higher purpose. We are stepping into the destiny that God has prepared for us, a destiny that we could never have fully realized through our own efforts. Surrender allows us to trust that God is working all things together for our good, even when we don't understand how or why. It's in surrender that we find the freedom to follow God's lead, to step out in faith, and to experience the abundant life He has promised us. True surrender is not passive. It's an active choice to trust God even when we don't have all the answers. It's about laying down our own will and trusting that God's plan is greater. And in that surrender, we find peace, joy, and fulfillment beyond anything we could have ever imagined on our own. God's plan for your life is always bigger than your current circumstances. It is so easy, especially when you're in the midst of a trial or challenge, to become consumed by your present situation. The difficulties of today can sometimes feel like they are all that exist, overshadowing any hope for the future. But the truth is, what you are facing right now is not the end of your story. God sees a far greater picture, and his plan for you extends beyond the confines of your current circumstance. Look at the Israelites, wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They had been delivered from Egypt, freed from slavery, but the road ahead was not easy. The wilderness was a place of testing, hardship, and struggle. They didn't have a clear understanding of the land they were heading to, and they certainly didn't know how long it would take to get there. There were moments when they felt abandoned, moments when they questioned whether God had truly brought them out of Egypt for this. But even in their wandering, God was with them. He was shaping them, teaching them, and preparing them for the land he had promised to give them. God had a plan for the Israelites, one that was far greater than their present struggles. The wilderness was not the end. It was a season of preparation. It was there that they learned to trust God, to rely on his provision, and to follow his leading. When they crossed into the promised land, they were not the same people who had left Egypt. They had been transformed, equipped with the strength, faith, and obedience necessary to possess the land God had promised them. What they couldn't see in the moment, their struggles in the wilderness, was part of a much greater plan that was unfolding, a plan that would bring them into the fullness of God's promises. Your circumstances right now may not reflect the promises God has spoken over your life. You may be facing obstacles that seem insurmountable. You may be experiencing setbacks, disappointments, or even moments of despair. But take heart, your current circumstances are not the end of the story. God is not limited by what you are going through right now. His plan for your life is bigger than any trial, any setback, or any disappointment. Just as he was working in the wilderness for the Israelites, he is working in your life today, even when you can't see it. Consider the life of David. Before he was crowned king of Israel, David spent years in the wilderness, running for his life from King Saul. He was anointed as king, but had to endure years of hardship, rejection, and uncertainty. There were moments when it seemed as though David would never see the fulfillment of God's promise. Yet in those years of struggle, God was preparing David for the kingship. David learned to rely on God, to fight battles, to trust in God's timing, and to grow in humility. The man who would eventually rule Israel was shaped in the wilderness. What David couldn't see in the moment was that every trial, every challenge, and every battle he faced was part of a greater plan that would bring him to the throne. You may not understand why you are facing certain challenges or why things aren't going according to your plans, but rest assured that God is working in ways you cannot see. Your current situation is not the final destination. There is a bigger plan at work, a plan that is leading you to a place of greater fulfillment, purpose, and blessing. Now, just as the Israelites had to pass through the wilderness to enter the promised land, you may have to walk through difficult seasons to arrive at the fullness of God's promises for your life. Think about the story of Joseph once more. Joseph was a young man with a dream, but his dream was shattered when his brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery. His circumstances were bleak. He ended up in prison, falsely accused and forgotten. Yet every step of the way, God was with him. Every situation, no matter how dire, was part of the greater plan that God had for Joseph. In prison, Joseph was elevated to a position of leadership, and eventually he was placed second in command over all of Egypt. What Joseph couldn't see in the midst of his trials was that each step, each struggle was leading him to the fulfillment of God's purpose for his life. His circumstances were never the end. They were the means through which God brought about his plan. There are moments in our lives when it feels as though we are stuck in a place of limitation or hardship. We may feel like we've reached a dead end or that our circumstances define us. But in those moments, we must remember that God's plan is not constrained by our present reality. He has the ability to take what seems impossible and turn it into something beautiful. He has the ability to take what seems like a dead end and open up a new path. Just as he did for Joseph, David, and the Israelites, he is working in your life right now, even when you don't see the outcome. Your struggle, your present challenge is not where God's plan ends. It is a step in the journey, a part of the process that will bring you into the destiny he has prepared for you. Just as the Israelites had to trust God in the wilderness, just as David had to trust God in the cave, you too must trust that God is at work in your life. His plan is bigger than your circumstances, and he is leading you to something greater. When life is tough, when it feels like you are stuck in a difficult situation, remember that God's plan for your life is always bigger than what you see right now. Your circumstances may change, but God's purpose for you remains the same. Trust that He is working everything together for your good, and that His plan will ultimately lead you to a place of blessing, fulfillment, and purpose. Trusting God's plan brings peace and joy, even in the midst of uncertainty. This is a truth that often eludes us, especially when we face life's most difficult seasons. We live in a world that constantly demands answers, that encourages us to figure everything out on our own and to be in control of every situation. But the peace and joy that God offers are not found in our ability to manage everything or to understand every detail. Instead, they are found in surrendering our lives to Him, in trusting that He has a good plan for us, even when things seem chaotic or unclear. The world offers a peace that is temporary, a peace that is based on circumstances and fleeting moments. If everything is going well, if the finances are in order, if the relationships are healthy, then we experience a form of peace. But this peace is fragile. It can be easily disrupted by the smallest of problems or the slightest shift in circumstances. The peace that God offers, however, is not based on our circumstances. It is not shaken by the ups and downs of life. It is a peace that transcends understanding, a peace that guards our hearts and minds, even when everything around us seems uncertain. Jean-Germain, Jesus spoke of this peace in John 14:27 when He said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid." Jesus was speaking to His disciples in the context of His impending departure. He knew that they would soon face trials, that their faith would be tested, and that their hearts would be troubled, but He assured them that His peace would be with them, a peace that would remain even in the midst of the most difficult of circumstances. This peace was not dependent on the world's definition of peace. It was a peace rooted in His presence and in the trust that He would never leave them or forsake them. When we trust God's plan for our lives, we open ourselves up to this peace. It's easy to try to control everything ourselves, to fix things in our own strength, and to search for solutions in our own understanding. But when we do this, we carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. We wear ourselves out trying to manage things that are beyond our control. Trusting in God's plan for our lives means releasing that burden. It means surrendering our anxieties, our fears, and our uncertainties into His capable hands. When we trust Him, we acknowledge that we don't have to have all the answers, that we don't have to control every outcome. We can rest in the assurance that He is in control and that He is working everything together for our good. This peace is not the absence of trouble, but the presence of God in the midst of it. When we trust God's plan, we experience the peace of knowing that we are not alone in our struggles. We know that He is with us every step of the way, that He sees our pain and our fears, and that He is working all things together for His glory and our good. It's a peace that allows us to sleep at night even when the world around us is in chaos. It's a peace that enables us to face the unknown with confidence, knowing that we are in the hands of a loving and faithful God. Along with this peace, trusting in God's plan also brings joy, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Joy is not the same as happiness. It is deeper and more enduring. Happiness is often fleeting and dependent on external factors, but joy is a fruit of the Spirit, something that grows within us as we trust in God's goodness and faithfulness. The Apostle Paul, despite enduring prison, beatings, and persecution, spoke about the joy that comes from trusting in God. In Philippians 4:4, he wrote, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I'll say it again, rejoice. Paul's joy wasn't based on his circumstances. It was based on his relationship with God and his confidence in His plan. When we trust God's plan, we shift our focus from our circumstances to His promises. Our joy becomes rooted in the fact that God is with us, that He has a good plan for our lives, and that He is working in us and through us to accomplish His purposes. This joy doesn't depend on whether things are going the way we want them to. It depends on the unchanging nature of God. Even in moments of loss, grief, or struggle, we can still experience joy because we know that God's love for us is unwavering and that His plan for us is still unfolding, even if we can't see it right now. There's a profound peace and joy that comes from knowing that God's plan is bigger than anything we could ever imagine. When we trust Him, we are not merely relying on our own strength or ability to create a good outcome. We are placing our trust in the One who created us, who knows us better than we know ourselves, and who has been working on our behalf long before we even knew we needed Him. This kind of trust is not passive, it's active. It's a daily choice to surrender our worries, our fears, and our desires to Him, knowing that His ways are higher than our ways and His thoughts higher than our thoughts. When we trust God's plan for our lives, we experience a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that holds us steady in the storm. And along with that peace comes joy. Joy that is not dependent on the world's definition of success or happiness, but joy that is rooted in the unshakable knowledge that God is in control, that He loves us, and that He is leading us to a future filled with hope and purpose. It's a joy that remains even when everything else seems uncertain, because it is anchored in the eternal truth of God's goodness and faithfulness. Trusting God's plan involves patience, especially when the road is long, the wait feels unbearable, and the answers seem distant. In a world where everything moves fast and we are used to instant gratification, patience is something that can be incredibly difficult to cultivate. We want things to happen quickly. We want answers now, solutions now, breakthroughs now, but God's plan doesn't always work on our timeline. Sometimes we have to wait, and in that waiting, God is doing something significant within us, preparing us for what He has in store. Patience is not simply about waiting for time to pass. It is about trusting God in the waiting, believing that He is working even when we can't see it. The story of Abraham and Sarah is a powerful reminder of the importance of patience in trusting God's plan. God had promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, yet years passed and Sarah remained barren. The promise seemed impossible. Abraham and Sarah, both well advanced in years, had to endure years of waiting, wondering when or if God's promise would ever be fulfilled. The waiting was not easy. In fact, it was so difficult that at one point they took matters into their own hands. Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child with her servant Hagar in an effort to help fulfill the promise. But this only led to complications, heartbreak, and pain. It was a reminder that when we take matters into our own hands instead of waiting for God's timing, we can often make things more difficult for ourselves. Yet God remained faithful to His promise. When Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, God fulfilled His promise and gave them a son, Isaac. The waiting had been long, but it had been part of God's plan. In that time of waiting, God was not idle. He was preparing them, refining their faith, and teaching them to trust Him completely. The lesson here is that God's plan often requires waiting, and in that waiting, He is shaping us. He is preparing us for what's next. If Abraham and Sarah had rushed ahead of God, if they had not waited for His timing, they would have missed out on the fulfillment of His perfect plan. In our own lives, waiting can feel like a test of our faith. We wonder why things are taking so long. We might feel like God has forgotten us or that He is not moving fast enough. But the truth is, God is never late. His timing is perfect. The Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes 3:11 that He has made everything beautiful in its time. Even when it seems like nothing is happening, God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating events, aligning circumstances, and preparing the perfect moment for His plan to unfold. Patience in trusting God's plan also involves trusting in His sovereignty. We must believe that God, in His infinite wisdom, knows what is best for us. Our limited perspective can often lead us to doubt or question His timing. We may want what we want when we want it, but God sees the bigger picture. He knows what we need and when we need it. Sometimes the delay is not a sign that God is not working. It is a sign that He is preparing something greater. There are moments when He is developing qualities in us, patience, perseverance, character, that we would not otherwise develop if we received the answer or breakthrough too quickly. The Apostle Paul talks about this in Romans 5:3-4, saying that we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Waiting also teaches us dependence on God. When we are in a season of waiting, we are reminded that we are not in control, and we never were. We are forced to rely on God's strength, His timing, and His wisdom. This can be uncomfortable, but it is also one of the most valuable lessons we can learn. In those moments of waiting, when we don't have the answers, we are drawn closer to God. We learn to seek Him more earnestly, to trust in His goodness, and to hold on to His promises. Waiting doesn't just shape the outcome, it shapes us. It refines our faith and teaches us to walk by faith and not by sight. Consider the example of the Israelites in the desert. God had promised them the land of Canaan, but before they could enter, they had to wait. Their journey should have taken only a short time, but because of their disobedience, their lack of trust, and their grumbling, they ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. This was a season of waiting, but it was also a season of refinement. During that time, God was teaching them to trust Him, to follow His lead, and to rely on His provision. They weren't just waiting for the promised land, they were being prepared for it. They were being made ready for what God had for them. They learn that trust in God's plan is not just about reaching the destination, but about the journey itself, the process of growing, learning, and becoming who God has called us to be. In our own lives, we may feel like we are wandering in a wilderness, waiting for our breakthrough or for God's promises to be fulfilled. But even in those wilderness seasons, God is not silent. He is at work in us, shaping us, teaching us, and preparing us for what lies ahead. The key is to trust Him in the waiting, to believe that He is working even when we don't see it. Just as He was with the Israelites in the desert, He is with us in our waiting. He is faithful, and He will bring us into the promises He has made. When we trust God's plan and wait patiently, we are acknowledging His sovereignty and His perfect timing. We are choosing to believe that He knows what is best for us, even when the wait feels long or uncertain. Patience is not about passively waiting for time to pass. It is about actively trusting that God is working in us, shaping us, and preparing us for what's to come. It is in the waiting that our faith grows, our character is refined, and our hearts are aligned with God's perfect plan. And when the time is right, God will bring about His promises in ways that far exceed our expectations. When we trust God's plan, we must be willing to let go of our own desires and preferences in favor of His will. It's easy to fall into the trap of believing that we know what's best for our lives, especially when things aren't going the way we hoped or planned. We make decisions based on what we can see, on what feels comfortable, and on what we think will bring us the most happiness. But God's plan often looks very different from our own plans. His ways are higher, His thoughts are deeper, and His purpose is greater than anything we can imagine. In Isaiah 55:8-9, God reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways." This powerful truth should humble us. When we trust God, we are acknowledging that He knows what is best for us, even when it doesn't make sense in the moment. Our limited perspective often leads us to desire things that are not in alignment with His will for us. God, in His wisdom, sees the full picture of our lives and knows what will truly bring us lasting peace, joy, and fulfillment. Let's take the example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. In His moment of greatest anguish, when He faced the weight of the cross and the suffering that awaited Him, Jesus prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22:42. Jesus, in His humanity, desired to avoid the pain and agony of the cross, but He understood that God's plan was far greater than His own desires. He was willing to submit Himself fully to the Father's will, trusting that through His sacrifice, salvation would be brought to all humanity. Jesus' surrender in that moment is the ultimate example of trusting God's plan, even when it means laying down our own will and desires for something far greater. Similarly, when we trust God's plan for our lives, we are often called to surrender our own ambitions, dreams, and timelines. We might have a certain career path in mind, a particular relationship we want, or a vision of how our lives should unfold. But God's plan may be different from what we envisioned. It may involve detours, delays, or changes we didn't anticipate. Those moments, it's important to remember that God is not taking us off course. He is leading us down a path that is even better than what we could have planned for ourselves. Trusting Him means accepting that His way is better than our own, even if it involves a process we don't fully understand. The story of Joseph illustrates this beautifully. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, wrongfully accused and thrown into prison. He could have easily been bitter, angry, or disillusioned by these unfair circumstances. Yet throughout his trials, Joseph continued to trust in God's plan. He didn't understand why things were happening the way they were, but he chose to remain faithful, and God was with him every step of the way. In time, Joseph's faithfulness led him to a position of power and influence in Egypt, where he was able to save many lives, including the lives of his own brothers and family. Joseph's life is a powerful reminder that God's plan often involves unexpected turns, but if we trust Him, He will bring about something greater than we could have ever imagined. Trusting God's plan also means embracing the uncertainty of the future. We may be uncertain about our careers, our relationships, or our purpose in life. The unknowns of the future can be intimidating, and they can lead to feelings of anxiety and fear. But when we trust God, we can be assured that He has already gone ahead of us. Proverbs 3:5-6 encourages us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. We may not always understand what the future holds, but we can trust that God is already there preparing the way for us. His plan is not just for today, but for our future as well, and He is faithful to lead us step by step, even when the path ahead seems unclear. When we submit our desires and our plans to God, we are not giving up our dreams or our passions. Rather, we are placing them in the hands of the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. He is the one who gave us those desires in the first place. And when we trust him with them, he will bring them to fulfillment in ways that far exceed what we could have ever imagined. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians 3:20 that God is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. When we trust God's plan, we are opening ourselves to the possibility of something greater than we could ever envision on our own. This trust is not always easy. It requires vulnerability and a willingness to let go of control, but it is also deeply freeing. When we trust God, we are no longer burdened by the pressure to have everything figured out or to control the outcomes of our lives. We can rest in the knowledge that the creator of the universe, the one who loves us more than we could ever comprehend, is guiding our every step. His plan is not for our harm, but for our good, and he will never lead us down a path that is not in alignment with his best for us. Ultimately, trusting God's plan is about surrendering to his perfect will and believing that he will work everything out for our good and his glory. It's about choosing to let go of our own desires, ambitions, and timelines, and trusting that God knows what is best. He is the master architect of our lives, and when we allow him to lead us, we can rest assured that he will bring us to a place of blessing, purpose, and fulfillment beyond anything we could have planned for ourselves. Trusting God's plan requires faith, patience, and surrender, but the reward is a life that is aligned with his perfect purpose and filled with his peace and joy.